Chapter 1: The Incident. The hum of the space station's air conditioning system mingled with the clatter of plates and the murmur of conversation as Danny O'Brien darted between tables in his small restaurant nestled within Sector Alpha 7. The smell of roasting vegetables, baking bread, and simmering sauces filled the narrow, cozy dining area, making patrons' mouths water. "Hey there, gorgeous," called a regular customer named Mike as he entered with another man. Danny's grin was as wide as ever as he approached to greet them. "Welcome back. Ready for our special today?" Zienta stood at the counter, her lavender skin stark against the dim lights of the space station's restaurant. She wore formal diplomatic robes and had silver hair in intricate braids that seemed almost ceremonial rather than casual. Her eyes darted nervously around the bustling dining room. "Good evening," she murmured to no one in particular as she took a seat at the bar counter, her presence immediately noticeable among the human patrons despite their welcoming demeanor. She opened the menu and scanned it carefully before making up her mind. "You'll have your chef's special of the day." Danny approached with a friendly smile plastered on his face, flour still speckled across his apron, as if he'd been in the middle of cooking when she arrived. "Welcome to our little place. Chef's choice today is I am ready," Zienta interrupted softly but firmly. "All right then." Danny clapped once and turned towards his kitchen staff, calling out orders with an infectious energy that somehow managed not to disturb the quiet alien in her seat. He returned quickly with a steaming plate of food she couldn't quite identify from the menu description alone, a blend of ingredients so complex it spoke volumes about human culinary skills. "There you go." Danny placed the dish down before Zienta, who picked up her fork hesitantly and took her first bite. A slow smile spread across her face. Clearly, she enjoyed the taste more than expected despite initial hesitation due to unfamiliarity with terrestrial cuisine. She laughed softly between bites as if reminiscing over something pleasant from home. Danny leaned closer in curiosity, eyes twinkling mischievously behind his freckled cheeks and red hair. "So tell me, what's it like being a junior diplomat for the Vethkai?" He propped one hand against the counter next to her shoulder as he spoke. Zienta swallowed hard before looking back up at him with wide violet eyes filled more by wonder than any discomfort she might felt earlier. "It is quite an experience," she managed through a mouthful of food, cheeks puffing cutely around her silver teeth when she inhaled suddenly. Danny chuckled good-naturedly at the sight, shaking his head fondly as he watched this alien woman struggle to reconcile her diplomatic formality with human casualness. "Ah, you know me," Danny said warmly while patting her shoulder gently but casually. "Always trying new things." Zienta's eyes shifted down from meeting his gaze straight on when she began savoring each bite meticulously, now trying desperately not to let the conversation be overly distracting. But their moment was broken abruptly by an awkward silence that settled over them as Danny noticed something amiss on her face. "You okay, darling? Was it my sauce?" he asked with genuine concern despite his flippant tone earlier about human food being exotic enough for aliens like Zienta to appreciate. "Why you?" she stuttered out in reply before freezing entirely, fork clattering loudly against the plate as if struck dumb by some unseen force between them. Her hands visibly trembled, and her eyes darted around frantically now more than ever before, avoiding eye contact with Danny, who stood there blinking perplexedly at this sudden change. Danny's face contorted from confusion to genuine worry in mere moments, while Zienta continued staring wide-eyed back up at him as if he'd just uttered some sacred phrase that sent shockwaves through her entire being. "Hey now," Danny coaxed softly but firmly, placing both hands on either side of the counter near where she sat so they were eye-level, again attempting to reassure without invading personal space further than necessary already. "You're scaring me a bit here. Was it something I said?" Zionta's breath caught in her throat, and for just an instant seemed about ready to confess all, but instead, after another moment of silence, staring up at Danny with such intensity that made him uncomfortable despite his best efforts to remain affable, she abruptly stood. "I need to go," were the only words whispered before turning away from both table and chef equally fast. Danny watched her leave through the door without so much as a backward glance, bewildered and confused by this turn of events entirely out of character for any human. He served Daylight alone, an alien visiting planet Earth's cuisine for what seemed like first time. He scratched his head in perplexed contemplation while wiping down behind counter until another patron called him over again to attend their needs. Later that same evening, around hour after Zionta's hasty departure and subsequent panic-induced flight from Danny's restaurant, security detail arrived at the door with a distinctly serious bearing about them. They showed badges of Vethkaya origin before entering without much delay, once admitted inside by staff recognizing them based on prior diplomatic engagements held recently within space station sectors. Danny was summoned forth to meet these representatives now that word had spread through appropriate channels how exactly his restaurant managed inadvertently invoke such a dramatic scene earlier today involving Zinta. He followed the guards back into a quiet room set aside just for formal discussions, knowing whatever awaited him would definitely be one of those unique experiences where human casualness clashed head-on with alien traditions. The hum of conversations faded as Danny was escorted away to explain himself an unusual and potentially perilous situation arising unexpectedly within Sector Alpha 7. Danny's heart raced as he was led down a series of corridors to what seemed like an interrogation room. The walls were made from a sleek, reflective material that cast eerie reflections back at him, and every step echoed loudly against the cold, sterile flooring. Security guards flanked both sides, their expressions stern but unyielding. Upon entering a large chamber lined with several low-rise sofas in various shades of deep blue and silver fabric, he noticed an array of Vethkai diplomats seated along one side of the room. Their lavender skin glowed softly under the artificial lighting that hovered overhead like floating discs, emitting no shadows or heat. The air was thick with a faint scent of formaldehyde mingled with subtle fragrances from their alien biology, something Danny couldn't quite identify but knew was ceremonial in nature. "Chef O'Brien," one of them said, rising to greet him formally yet without much warmth. "Please take your seat." Danny looked around nervously before nodding and sitting down on the offered sofa across a polished wooden table that gleamed under the artificial light. The guards left once he sat but kept their presence known by remaining just outside the room. "We have summoned you here, Chef O'Brien," another diplomat began in crisp tones devoid of any personal touch or expression that humans might use for reassurance or empathy. "Today's events involving your customer, Zionta, are unprecedented and require immediate clarification." Danny swallowed hard, trying to think how he could explain his actions without sounding ridiculous. "Well," Danny started hesitantly, leaning forward slightly on the sofa cushions as though this proximity would make it easier for them to understand him. "I didn't mean anything by calling her love. It's just a casual term back home, like saying dear or sweetheart. No big deal." The diplomat's eyes narrowed ever so slightly at his explanation, but remained impassive otherwise, not betraying any sign of understanding from Danny's perspective. In Vethkai culture, another one continued in even more formal tones than before. The terms love, beloved, or similar endearments hold a binding legal status equivalent to marriage proposals. Danny's eyes widened, and his hand instinctively went up to rub the back of his neck nervously. "Oh, I didn't know that," he said slowly, realizing just how dire this situation could become if they took it seriously. "You are fully aware now," another diplomat chimed in with a tone hinting at displeasure mixed with formality, "as such actions carry weight under our laws and customs, Mr. O'Brien." Zienta stood nearby, but did not approach him directly, instead choosing to remain respectfully distant yet still within earshot of their conversation. Her posture was rigid, as if holding herself back from fully participating in the proceedings. Danny glanced over at her briefly before turning his attention back to the panel of Vethkai officials seated before him, feeling a mix of dread and curiosity swirling inside him about this alien culture he knew almost nothing about but could now see had serious implications for everyone involved here today. "Look," Danny said earnestly, leaning forward slightly again, hoping that some level of sincerity might help bridge the gap between their vastly different cultural expectations. "I understand I've caused a misunderstanding, or maybe even an offense. Is there any way this can just be forgotten?" The diplomats exchanged glances amongst themselves before returning to address him once more collectively rather than as individuals, which made Danny feel like he was facing some sort of collective entity rather than actual people. "The law is inflexible, Chef O'Brien," one said coolly. "Either you honor the proposal by formalizing your relationship under Vethkai customs or face charges for attempting to undermine our legal traditions." Danny's cheeks flushed as understanding dawned upon him like a cold wave. What was meant to be casual now had serious repercussions beyond anything he ever imagined possible with something so seemingly simple yet culturally charged in another world. His mind raced, searching desperately for any loophole or misunderstanding that could resolve this situation before it spiraled further out of control. "Can I at least talk to her?" Danny asked urgently, after a moment's pause where his thoughts had been racing wildly through every possibility he knew might work or didn't want to think about not working. "Just the two of us? Maybe we can figure something out." The diplomats exchanged another set of formal nods before addressing him again, almost as one entity. "Now an hour is granted for you both to resolve this matter according to your mutual agreement." With that, they motioned silently towards a door just off their main chamber, and Danny felt compelled to follow despite the weight pressing down on his shoulders from all angles. As he turned away, Zienta finally made her way over hesitantly, almost as if she too was unsure what might come next, but willing herself forward regardless. The room they entered for their private conversation had a much warmer atmosphere compared to where Danny just spoke with the panel of diplomats. Rich wooden furniture and soft cushions lined walls, covered in calming greenery that seemed to give off natural light of its own. Zienta sat down opposite him on another plush sofa across from where he found himself situated. Danny cleared his throat nervously, meeting her lavender gaze finally. After so much time since their initial awkward encounter over food earlier today. "Hey there," Danny said softly, but with all the sincerity he could muster. "I really didn't mean to cause any trouble. Well, love is just something we say back home sometimes without meaning it literally." Zienta blinked several times, as if processing his words carefully before responding in a hushed tone tinged with some residual panic still lingering beneath her composed demeanor. "In my culture, she began slowly, but steadily, now looking him directly in the eye. Unlike earlier, such terms are sacred. They signify deep commitment and marital intent. Danny nodded solemnly. He wanted to reach out and put his hand on hers for comfort or reassurance, but hesitated, knowing how much personal space meant between them, despite his friendly nature tending towards such gestures with friends back home. "I get that now," Danny said quietly, genuinely meaning it. "I didn't mean anything by what I called you earlier. Honest." Her gaze softened ever so slightly as she met his earnest expression across the room. "I understand your intentions were not malicious," Scienta admitted slowly, after a moment of silence where they both seemed to absorb this new understanding, albeit tentatively. A clock on one wall ticked loudly, marking precious minutes slipping away, while these two individuals from such vastly different worlds tried their best to bridge gaps between them. Danny leaned forward slightly, again trying his utmost for some formality mixed with honesty that might help mend things. "I'm sorry if I made you uncomfortable or scared earlier," he confessed sincerely. Scienta nodded, her lavender skin visibly relaxing ever so minutely despite the still formal environment around them now having calmed somewhat as a result of their direct communication. "It was an unexpected misunderstanding," she replied coolly, but with genuine relief underlying those words. Danny felt his shoulders drop and simultaneous relaxation and tension easing away. He could see there might be hope for resolution after all here, despite the initial shock that had made this situation seem so dire earlier today when it first began unraveling around them. He smiled softly, still cautious, knowing how much was at stake now, but feeling a glimmer of optimism about their shared humanity, even if she hailed from another world entirely. "Can we find some way to clear things up?" Danny asked, with genuine hope coloring his voice despite the formal setting and cultural barriers between them both. Scienta nodded again after a moment's pause, her lavender eyes searching him as though looking for clues within this human chef before deciding aloud, "Perhaps there must be some mutual ground we can find to respect our differing traditions." Danny's heart lifted ever so slightly at those words, hope beginning to bloom despite the formal setting and weight of their situation pressing down on both of them now. "Yeah," Danny agreed with a smile, trying not to let it seem overly casual given the gravity of everything around him currently. "I think we can figure something out." The time was running short as they sat there across from each other, attempting to navigate this complex cultural bridge between their two worlds. The clock on wall continued ticking steadily, marking minutes slipping away towards that critical deadline where a solution needed found before things could spiral further beyond control. Chef Danny O'Brien adjusted his apron nervously as he sat across from Scienta in the mediation center's private room on the space station. The sterile white walls were lined with calming water features that trickled softly beside them, creating a backdrop of soothing murmurs and soft splashes interspersed by the occasional hum of distant machinery. "Look," Danny began, leaning forward slightly, "I'm really sorry about what happened earlier today. It's just, I didn't mean to cause any trouble." Scienta tilted her head ever so slightly, a subtle sign of interest despite her formal demeanor. Her silver braids shimmered in the soft ambient light that cast long shadows across their faces. "I understand your intentions were not malicious," she said quietly, after a moment's pause. "I have never encountered such casualness before." Danny nodded gratefully for her understanding and continued, his voice warm but careful. "Well, we humans use words to mean different things than you do on Vethkai. Like I say love all the time with my mates." Scienta's violet eyes widened slightly as she interrupted him, her voice firm yet curious. "You mentioned earlier that love was a term of endearment in your culture? Danny smiled apologetically and nodded eagerly to confirm. Yeah, I call everyone love. It's just how we do things back home. My nan used it all the time. Even my postman gets called love when he delivers mail. Zinta's expression shifted into one of deep contemplation as she processed this information. The soft glow from the water features cast intricate patterns on her lavender skin, making her look almost ethereal in that moment. Do words mean so little to you then? She asked softly, genuinely puzzled by their cultural difference. Danny laughed lightly, shaking his head and waving a hand dismissively. Oh no, words are everything for us humans. Love isn't just romantic, it's about warmth, connection. Her eyes sparkled with intrigue as she listened intently to each word he spoke. For the first time since their encounter began, an unusual softness seemed to bloom within her lavender features. Then why do you use such significant words so casually? Zinta probed further, leaning closer towards him over the table. Danny's smile widened in response as his cheeks flushed slightly from her direct inquiry. It's about how we relate to each other, he explained earnestly, finding it easier now that they were engaging on a more personal level despite their cultural divide. When I say love, it means someone is part of my life. She listened intently, nodding slowly, as if considering the depth and meaning behind his words. Like family, she ventured softly, after several moments had passed between them in mutual thoughtfulness. Danny's eyes softened even further at her insightful question. Yeah, he replied with a heartfelt smile. Exactly like that. Zinta looked down momentarily, processing this revelation about human culture before meeting Danny's gaze, once more her lavender skin paling slightly as she seemed to consider something deeply personal and perhaps unexpected. Danny watched her closely. The tension in the room began easing gradually as they both navigated through their initial shock towards a mutual understanding. So, he started, hesitantly placing his hands flat on the table, but refraining from making any physical gestures that might be culturally inappropriate for her species. Do you think we can maybe find some common ground here? Her violet eyes softened as she regarded him with renewed respect and interest. Nodding slowly. I believe there must be a way, Zinta confirmed softly, after another moment of reflective silence. Danny's shoulders visibly relaxed at this response, the weight of their previous misunderstanding lifting slightly from his chest to allow optimism to take root instead. He nodded confidently, in agreement, but kept himself rooted firmly within her cultural boundaries. No more sudden gestures or casual terms until they could establish a new form of mutual understanding based on respect for both their traditions. We can figure something out, Danny insisted with renewed hope and sincerity. I think there's still room to bridge this gap between us. She stared back at him then, eyes filled not just with the rigid formalism she had initially brought into this meeting, but now a hint of genuine curiosity mixed with respect for his human perspective. I must admit, Zinta admitted quietly, after another moment of consideration and silence passing between them, I actually found it rather refreshing to be spoken to so informally. Danny's eyes widened slightly in pleasant surprise. He leaned forward eagerly, as if wanting to embrace her warmly, but kept himself firmly restrained by the cultural chasm, yet bridged tentatively. The clock on one wall ticked loudly behind them, marking precious minutes as slipping away, while these two individuals from such vastly different worlds had slowly started building a connection despite their initial shock. Really? He asked softly, almost hesitantly, in awe that his casual approach might have actually made an impression with her beyond mere misunderstanding or offense. Like, you liked B. ain't treated like someone rather than just another diplomat? Xintha's lavender skin shifted slightly as she considered this notion before nodding once more, her eyes reflecting a rare moment of genuine warmth towards Danny despite the gravity and weight they both shared in finding common ground amidst their divergent cultures. "Yes," Xintha had admitted quietly, her voice soft yet resolute, with an internal change manifesting outwardly. "I did." And so ended this pivotal chapter where two vastly different beings had begun to bridge gaps, not just between them, but across worlds, laying the groundwork for mutual respect and understanding that would continue shaping their unique journey together as it unfolded beyond the mediation room's walls. Xintha stood awkwardly by the door of Danny's small restaurant, her lavender skin pale and silver hair perfectly braided, as if to emphasize just how formal she was despite being inside a human establishment well after hours. The scent of spices lingered in the air from earlier cooking sessions, mixed with the faint aroma of fresh bread baking, something that hadn't been part of her world's culinary traditions. Danny approached cautiously, but still managed to smile warmly at Xintha as he ushered her through the door leading into his domain after closing time. His red hair and freckles were illuminated by the soft glow of overhead lights, casting a gentle warmth over his face. "All right now," Danny said, with an easygoing Irish charm that seemed almost out of place given their circumstances. "Let's make sure we don't have any more awkward misunderstandings." He guided her to one of the booths near the back where they could talk without prying eyes or ears. Xintha nodded silently, grateful for his attempt at easing the tension, but still feeling quite ill at ease despite being in such a warm and inviting setting. She was acutely aware that making any slip-ups in her culture could lead to dire consequences. "Sit down there," Danny instructed gently, as he pointed towards an empty chair beside him with a flick of his wrist, then moved behind the counter where he started busying himself with finding cooking utensils for what she assumed would be another attempt at human food preparation. Danny looked up from his work and met her gaze again before asking softly, but clearly so, "Xintha, what do you want to eat?" For a moment she was struck speechless by the question, so simple yet so profound in its implications of choice versus obligation within her culture's rigid expectations. She had never been given such an opportunity herself. I am not certain," admitted Xintha softly, feeling both exposed and oddly liberated in admitting it to him. "Everything is dictated for me." Danny paused his movements at the stove, turning around slowly with a thoughtful expression on his face before nodding understandingly. He leaned against the counter, facing her directly now. "Then let's figure that out," Danny suggested softly but earnestly as he walked back towards where she was sitting and took up residence beside her once more, though always mindful of maintaining respectful space between them given their vastly different cultural backgrounds. "No politics. Just you and me." Xintha stared at him, a rare warmth flickering in the depths of her violet eyes for what felt like the first time since she had been stationed here. She wasn't sure if it was just his kind demeanor or the sense that he genuinely meant to help her understand something about herself beyond formalities. She nodded slowly, after another moment of consideration. I mean, we could perhaps discuss." Danny smiled warmly at this tentative acceptance and motioned towards a corner cupboard where various herbs and spices were neatly arranged. He started preparing what seemed like some kind of stir-fry, while engaging Xintha in conversation. "Tell me about your childhood," he began with genuine interest as he chopped vegetables skillfully. Xintha blinked at him, surprised by the question, but intrigued nonetheless to see how open Danny was being despite their cultural divide. She hesitated only briefly before answering truthfully. I had no such thing called childhood. Training in strict education started from a very young age. Ah, replied Danny thoughtfully, as he listened attentively, stirring ingredients in the pan with deft motions of his hands. Didn't you have fun, or anything resembling joy? The question seemed to catch her off guard. Zion hadn't ever been asked something so personal and human-like by someone outside her immediate family before. It took a moment for her to formulate an answer, and when she did speak again, there was more than just formality in her tone. Joy is not a concept we often associate with our lives. Danny hummed softly, understanding, but also feeling a twinge of sadness at the thought. He continued preparing their meal while asking another question, which surprised Zion even more. And how do you feel about being here now? Being this close to someone who's so different from what you're used to? Zintha blinked again, as if trying to process his words fully before she spoke. I find it intriguing, admitted the alien girl, with a hint of genuine curiosity coloring her voice. Your casualness is fascinating. Danny chuckled softly, glancing over at Zion, who was watching him intently with an almost wistful expression on her face. That's one way to put it. You're probably used to lots of formality and rules though, right? She nodded solemnly in confirmation. The air between them thickened slightly as they both navigated this new, uncharted territory together. Tell me more about your culture, encouraged Danny gently, trying not to overstep any boundaries, yet also genuinely wanting to understand her better now that he had accidentally caused such a stir with his earlier slip-up. I am part of the Vethkai species, she explained solemnly, after collecting herself. Our traditions dictate every aspect of our lives from birth until death. Wow, sounds intense, said Danny without any judgment, simply expressing genuine interest rather than shock or disdain. Zintha seemed a bit surprised by his response, clearly not expecting such casual acceptance from someone so fundamentally different yet strangely approachable. He continued chatting with her as he cooked the meal, asking questions about everything from their diplomatic customs to how they view friendship and relationships within their society. She found herself opening up more than ever before in her life under Danny's easygoing demeanor, which somehow managed not to offend, even when she felt exposed by his probing yet gentle inquiries. The food was ready eventually. It smelt fragrant and inviting as he placed a plate down beside Zion, with several different components on the dish arranged artfully. She looked at him questioningly. How do I? Just dig in, Danny said cheerfully, encouraging her to taste something entirely foreign, but also strangely alluring given his careful preparation. She picked up chopsticks and tried a bite, a complex mix of flavors that was unexpected yet oddly satisfying. It's very different, she murmured thoughtfully once it had settled on her tongue, briefly before swallowing with surprise at how pleasant the sensation actually felt despite never having encountered such food previously in her life. Good, Danny beamed proudly, nodding approvingly, even though he couldn't taste what she was experiencing firsthand. I'm glad you like it. As they ate together and conversed more freely than ever before, Danny asking about Zion's upbringing while listening intently to every word despite not knowing everything their customs mean, found himself genuinely curious about the alien girl's experiences in life. Do you have anyone close back home? Danny asked suddenly, his tone soft yet sincere, as if seeking something beyond just information, but a deeper connection. Zintha paused mid-chew once more before answering truthfully. I do not have personal relationships, she admitted quietly. Only duties and expectations. Danny's smile faltered slightly at this, feeling both touched by her honesty and saddened by the implications of such an existence, devoid of genuine human interaction that he took for granted daily. "Then let's change things up tonight," Danny suggested softly yet resolutely, as if trying to bring something different into her life temporarily just through their time together. "Let's forget about all those formalities for a bit and talk like real people." Zinta stared at him wide-eyed once more, her violet eyes reflecting the lights from above, almost shimmering with an unexpected intensity now that she was faced not only with human customs, but also this unusual kind of approach where someone seemed genuinely interested in getting to know her rather than merely her title or role. "Tonight," she repeated quietly, as if testing out the concept itself, his idea of being more casual, less formal. "You want friendship?" Danny nodded firmly. "Yes. Just be yourself tonight." A rare smile touched Zinta's lips, thin, soft curve that almost seemed to defy her usual composed nature. It was a moment captured between them, now both aware yet unspoken was the fact that this could mean much more than just casual dining together despite all their cultural boundaries. "So," Danny started again after they finished eating, placing his own plate aside with satisfaction, "now tell me what you want for yourself. Not your duties or expectations, but whatever might make you happy." Her violet eyes widened even further in surprise. She had never been asked such a direct yet simple question before. She seemed to struggle internally, as if trying to formulate an answer that hadn't existed until now. I do not know," Zinta admitted quietly, her voice almost hesitant, but also filled with the beginnings of something new stirring within her possibility and curiosity. "Then let's figure it out together tonight," Danny insisted softly yet firmly. "Just us." For a few long moments, they simply looked at each other, Zinta seeing an unusual friend in Danny, whose casualness made him almost approachable despite all their differences, while Danny glimpsed something rare, genuine vulnerability from the usually formal diplomat as she slowly began opening up. She took a deep breath then, her lavender skin paling slightly, but also seeming more alive with possibility than before. "Thank you," Zinta said softly, genuinely grateful for this unexpected moment of human warmth and connection that was so different yet oddly comforting to someone used only to strict formality. Danny smiled warmly at her. "Of course. Now, shall we see what happens next?" She nodded slowly in response, her eyes reflecting a mix of surprise and hope, as if contemplating something new forming between them despite the cultural chasm they bridged tentatively but steadily now through their late-night conversation and shared meal together. Danny moved closer, then carefully took her hand, gently without overstepping boundaries he had established earlier. "Is this permitted?" she asked hesitantly, unsure whether such a gesture was acceptable given their different worlds, yet also curious about what it could mean beyond formality for once in her life. He grinned at her softly. "I'm Irish," Danny said with conviction and warmth still guiding him carefully through unfamiliar territory. "We don't ask permission." And so ended this pivotal night, where two vastly different beings had started bridging gaps, not just between them, but across worlds, laying the groundwork for mutual respect and understanding that would continue shaping their unique journey together as it unfolded beyond the walls of Danny's little restaurant late into the quiet hours when most other inhabitants were asleep. Chef Danny O'Brien wiped his hands on a clean apron, standing straight and looking into the mirror hanging above the station's entranceway, where he usually saw only himself or early morning patrons before opening hours. Today was different. Today, His reflection showed him in full attire for what felt like an interstellar wedding rather than just another day at work. A crisp, slightly oversized suit from a friend back on Earth sat uncomfortably against his freckled skin and red hair, but he ignored the itchiness to focus on one thing, making sure Scientha's formalities were handled with care. The space station was alive with activity. Around them, hum of machinery in distant compartments mixed with soft murmurs echoing down corridors. The air smelled faintly metallic here at this part of the docking bay where ships and visitors from various galaxies landed. An odd mix of human scents like coffee brewing next to alien ones that hinted at exotic fruits or minerals unknown on Earth. "Are you ready?" Danny asked himself aloud in a shaky voice while checking his reflection once more. The suit's lapels seemed too wide for him, but also carried some significance as he understood it was meant to look good, not just for Scientha, but her entire family, who'd arrived earlier today. Pale lavender-skinned individuals dressed formally like her. He stepped out into the main docking area, where a few other crew members and diplomats moved about their duties. He could see them in periphery. Some paused briefly when they noticed him walking through with his head held high, even if his heart thumped uncomfortably inside his chest at how out of place he felt, like an actor trying to memorize lines on stage before an audience. The docking bay was bustling, but also had a certain quiet dignity about it. Ships docked and undocked around them. In the distance, the air glimmered with slight reflections from nearby holographic displays that showed weather patterns, ship movements, or advertisements for local businesses catering to diverse species passing through. It smelled faintly of polished metal, synthetic scents designed to evoke a sense of cleanliness and order. Danny approached where Scientha was waiting along with her family members. Their presence seemed like an army on parade compared to him in his ill-fitting suit, standing beside them as if he had no right to be there. They didn't speak until he did, a simple nod acknowledging each other's existence, while eyes flickered briefly towards one another before returning back to formality. "Jeff, Danny," Scientha greeted softly, but clearly recognizing that the moment called for more than just words. There was a certain gravity in her tone and posture. "Thank you for coming." Danny nodded, feeling like he needed permission from some unseen authority figure just by how they all looked at him. "It's my honor," Danny replied, his voice steady despite nerves threatening to overpower the situation. "I want this right." A Vethkai elder stepped forward then, eyes sharp as he scrutinized Danny with a critical gaze. His lavender skin was darker around the edges, indicating authority and age within their society. "Chef O'Brien," he began formally, in heavily accented human language, voice carrying more command than anyone else's had yet. "Yes," Danny responded quickly, but without stepping back or lowering his head, despite feeling smaller now under such scrutiny from Scientha's elders, who seemed ready to judge him harshly for the mess caused by one accidental "thank you." "You will understand," said another Vethkai family member, this time a silver-haired woman with deep violet eyes similar to those of her daughter, but carrying wisdom behind them. Shell looked at Danny, then glanced towards Scientha, who hesitated slightly before meeting their gaze firmly. "This ceremony must be followed by strict tradition." Danny swallowed hard against the lump forming in his throat as he nodded again, this time more carefully. "I understand." The elder Vethkai continued with a tone that conveyed both importance and weightiness to what was being said next, a sense of finality lingering heavily over them all. "Tonight we will hold the necessary ceremony dictated by custom between our people." He paused briefly before continuing with deliberate precision, voice carrying clear expectations for those involved, either acceptance or rejection must be made. Danny felt a knot tighten in his stomach, but forced himself to stay calm as he faced Sci-Fi, who looked back at him nervously yet resolutely. She spoke next without looking away from Danny. Chef O'Brien, she began, carefully choosing her words, even though it seemed obvious where this was going. You will now have an opportunity to formally reject my proposal. A collective hush fell over the group for a moment, making every sound amplified, soft clink of metal against stone floor or shifting breaths audible. Danny looked at Zion, then felt her gaze searching his face, as if she hoped to find something there that would change everything, but knew no words could convey what he wished they did. Formally, Danny echoed back, trying to steady the quiver in his voice yet feeling like it was impossible when looking into Cyntha's worried eyes. That's why you're here now. She nodded slowly, but didn't speak again, as if waiting for him to say more, something that would break this uneasy silence they were trapped within. Danny took a deep breath, then looked around briefly at the watching faces and distant echoes of station life, before focusing back on Cyntha, whose whole demeanor reflected both her duty yet also an unspoken hope. He didn't want to shatter, even though it was easier than facing what came next. Rejection, Danny said plainly with certainty now, determined not just for himself, but because seeing disappointment in her eyes wasn't an option when this much had already been muddled. Everyone turned quiet again, the elder Vethkai motioning silently towards Sci-Fi, who stood stiffly yet clearly trembling inside, as if each moment dragged out felt like 1,000 years. She took another breath, then looked at Danny once more, violet eyes meeting his green ones with such intensity that it was impossible to look away. Chef O'Brien, she began slowly but clearly, words carrying weight beyond their syllables alone. Thank you for your company tonight. A flicker of confusion crossed her face momentarily before resolving into something else entirely. She hesitated, then looked around briefly at the watching faces, searching almost desperately, as if hoping to find some alternative among them even though none existed. I do not know how to proceed, she admitted quietly, after another long moment had passed between them, uncertainty evident in every line of her body language and tone, which now seemed more hesitant than ever before. These human customs. Danny's heart squeezed tight at the sight. He wanted so badly for her to see beyond formality, despite knowing such a bridge might be too wide here, where ancient traditions dictated everything. Cyntha, Danny said gently, then, moving closer toward her, as if reaching out could somehow change what needed to happen next. No matter what happens now, you are still the same person. She blinked slowly at him in confusion again, but also something else he hadn't expected yet dared hope possibility. I have been shown kindness, Tade. Something rare here, Cyntha continued then, her voice softer than before, as if speaking more to herself rather than anyone around them. Something that might mean. The elder Vethkai shifted uncomfortably from where they stood, silent and observant, clearly uncomfortable at this deviation, but also uncertain how far he could push without violating the very traditions dictating their presence here. Mean what? Danny asked softly then, urging her to continue despite knowing full well it might end up breaking everything instead of fixing anything. Cyntha? She looked back at him again, a mix of wonderment and confusion lingering in those wide violet eyes, as if seeing something new forming there between them, which neither understood yet dared wish for. I do not know, she admitted slowly, more to herself now than anyone else present. Yet the tone changed slightly too, like an opening bloom, hesitant, but starting nonetheless against all odds. But tonight Cyntha hesitated again, then looked around nervously, before returning her gaze back towards Danny, whose heart pounded louder, just thinking about what this could mean. "Tonight, I want something different," she said quietly yet clearly into the room. "I wish to speak differently from custom." A collective gasp went through those gathered as Xantha's father stepped forward then, his voice firm despite visible shock. "What do you mean?" "I ask not for rejection," Xantha continued softly, but steadily, like each word was pulling her further away from everything she knew yet towards something unknown and potentially terrifying. I request courtship." Silence fell again, as if even the station itself held its breath, waiting to see what would come next in this moment that bridged two worlds far apart by more than just space. The elder Vethke looked bewildered, then turned towards Xantha's father, who appeared equally stunned, yet perhaps slightly less angry at this twist. No one moved or spoke for a long moment. The tension was palpable, every breath amplified, in the stillness of that room where two beings had started bridging gaps despite all odds. Danny stood there quietly, his heart swelling with warmth he hadn't felt before as Xantha's eyes met his once more, now smiling softly instead of trembling, a true smile reflecting something new beginning between them against all expected paths set by ancient rules and customs. He didn't know what would happen next, but in that moment it seemed like anything was possible. Her family exchanged looks, in a mixture of shock, disbelief, and perhaps even admiration mingling across their pale faces. The elder Vethkai nodded slowly, as if coming to terms with this unexpected turn despite all traditions being broken. She turned back towards Danny finally, now smiling widely for what felt like genuine happiness breaking through constraints she never thought would ease. Looking at him warmly despite everything. "Thank you, Chef," she said softly yet clearly. Then he grinned broadly in return, but also somewhat nervously, still not quite sure where this led, but knowing he'd follow whatever path came next with her by his side now that such a moment had changed everything. And so ended the pivotal ceremony of rejection and acceptance. Though neither term was used as expected, something far more significant yet undefined began here between two vastly different beings who found common ground through mutual respect and understanding. Despite all cultural barriers, they bridged tentatively but steadily now. Danny led Xantha up to his rooftop kitchen after the ceremony had dissolved into a mix of whispered conversations and awkward silences. The night air was cool against their skin as they stepped out onto the small deck where he kept a few plants that thrived on the artificial sunlight. "Here we are," Danny said, gesturing towards two chairs set up at one corner with a view of the stars sprawling across the blackness like diamonds scattered in ink. "You must be freezing out here. Let me get you something warm." Xantha shook her head as she took a seat, her lavender skin seeming to glow subtly under the light from inside Danny's restaurant below them. She fiddled with the hem of her diplomatic robe nervously before looking up at him. "Chef Danny," she began slowly, "there is much I need to explain." He smiled warmly, sitting down beside her without another word and reaching over to squeeze her hand gently. The rooftop was quiet except for a soft hum from some distant machinery on the station and the occasional breeze that ruffled his red hair. "I know," he said softly, turning towards her with an encouraging smile in his eyes. "I can see you're trying your best." She took a deep breath, letting out a long sigh before starting again in more deliberate tones. "In my culture, among the Vethke, have many customs and traditions that govern how we interact socially and romantically." Her voice wavered slightly, but she pushed on bravely. "When someone wishes to formally court another individual as part of marriage proceedings, it's customary for them both to engage in a series of rituals designed to test compatibility before any proposal occurs. Danny listened intently, nodding thoughtfully, even though he felt like half the explanation had flown right over his head due to the complexity and formality of her words. But seeing how hard she was trying made him feel less worried. "Tonight, Zion," continued hesitantly, I requested quartz hip from you." Danny blinked several times, a wide grin spreading across his face as comprehension dawned on him. "You mean like being boy, friend and girlfriend?" She blushed lavender deeply but nodded once in confirmation. "I see. Well then," he said with genuine joy shining through his voice despite the strangeness of it all for both of them, "that sounds amazing." They sat there quietly under the stars while Danny processed what had just happened and how differently this would have gone if she were back home where every word and gesture carried so much weight. Here, though, he felt like they could take things at their own pace without worrying about setting off cultural landmines. "So," he began after a long moment of silence, "does that mean you're not mad?" Her violet eyes softened in understanding with an affectionate smile tugging her lips upwards. "I am not angry. I was surprised." He chuckled lightly, then squeezed her hand again reassuringly while they gazed out at the starry expanse together. "Good," Danny said softly, looking back down to meet her gaze, fully now filled only warmth and sincerity despite everything that had transpired earlier today. "Because if we're going to do this thing properly, I think there's a lot you need to know about human courtship." She blinked wide-eyed at him, but didn't pull away when he pulled her closer, so they were side by side on the chair with shoulders touching lightly. "First lesson," Danny said playfully, leaning in until his face was close enough that she could feel his breath against hers, "is understanding what I mean by calling you love." A slight tremor went through Zion at this reminder of earlier confusion, but then her lavender cheeks flushed pink again, as if remembering their shared kiss and everything since. "I do not understand the term," she confessed quietly with a glance towards him out of the corner of her eye. "It feels wrong to use it so casually." Danny laughed lightly, giving her hand another squeeze before turning slightly more serious. "That's okay though, because in human culture, calling someone love isn't about marriage or declarations. It's just affectionate." She tilted her head curiously at his explanation. "You see," he elaborated patiently with a soft smile on his lips, "it doesn't matter if you've known the person for days or decades. Hera saying love means I care deeply for them right now." Zion,'s eyes widened in surprise as she processed this new information, while looking away momentarily to collect herself. "And it can mean many things," Danny added softly, reaching out with his free hand to gently cup her cheek. "It could be an expression of gratitude after a kind gesture, or simply stating that I'm glad you're here." She met his gaze again, then felt the warmth in them reflected back from him, and somehow found herself leaning into the touch even more, as if drawn by some invisible thread connecting their hearts. "So," she whispered hesitantly, "if we were to court?" He nodded encouragingly, while giving her a reassuring smile that seemed to radiate pure comfort and support through everything around them. "Yes, I think it's time for us to actually get to know each other properly." A small but genuine smile finally curved Zion's lips upward, now reflecting true joy breaking free from formal constraints as she turned back towards Danny fully, this time letting go of the stiff reserve that had kept her contained earlier. Is that acceptable?" she asked softly, almost timidly, despite everything changing so suddenly around them. "You don't seem upset by my request." Danny chuckled lightly while shaking his head. No, it's not like I'm upset at all, though you caught me completely off guard there for a moment." She giggled nervously, then blushed even darker, seeing him laugh easily about the whole situation. But really, she probed gently, wanting to make sure he meant what he was saying fully now, without any hidden reservations or discomfort lurking behind it. "You're okay with this?" He nodded earnestly while squeezing her hand again reassuringly. "Of course, love, I wouldn't have proposed if I wasn't ready for whatever comes next." She blinked wide-eyed at him, then looked down briefly, as if collecting thoughts before lifting violet gaze up towards his own once more, now filled only sincerity and mutual understanding. "Then, all me that," she requested softly, almost shyly, despite everything changing so quickly around them. "Just to hear it again." Danny smiled warmly while reaching out with both hands, this time, then wrapping one arm protectively over her shoulder, pulling her closer against him as he leaned in close enough now where their foreheads brushed gently. "All right, love," Danny said softly, almost reverently, despite everything changing so quickly around them. "You asked for it." And as if on cue, she leaned up slightly too, until lips met briefly but sweetly before parting once more, with warm smiles exchanging between each other instead of just the words or formalities that bound their cultures otherwise. She didn't tremble this time when he called her love. Instead, all she could do was hold him tighter and lean into the embrace, as if finally finding home in his arms amidst a sea full of uncertainty, it somehow braving it together against everything else trying to pull them apart. They stayed like that on Danny's rooftop long after night had fallen completely around them, gazing up at stars while sharing laughter, promises, and dreams about tomorrow beyond just tonight's unexpected turn.